Today, I'm excited to have Paul Dudley on the podcast. Paul is the co founder and CEO of Streamkap, which is a real time data streaming platform. He had also previously founded an ETL solution called Gravity, which was eventually acquired in 2022, and has held leadership roles at both BrightEdge and NetBase Solutions. And he has a degree in physics from the California Polytechnic State University. It was really great to have him on the podcast because there's a lot of really interesting use cases that real time streaming enables. And to have someone who's really at the forefront of that and dive deep into it gave me some really, really great insights I didn't have before. And hopefully you feel the same as well. So, with that said, I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Building Blocks podcast. Paul, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, excited to be here. Appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, no, super excited to have you on and talk about Streamkap and your journey and some of the great stuff you guys are working on. But we always get the podcast started with trying to understand what brought you to this point. So, what got you into entrepreneurship? Like, what got you to this point?
Yeah, so I think I always was interested in it, and have had folks in my life who had started companies, and um, yeah, so it's something I kind of had in my mind. Um, and I've worked in startups my whole career, so I think
Mhm.
that also kind of and early. I started every company I worked at. I started at relatively early stage, so yeah, I think it was something I had in my mind, and ended up connecting with my co-founder at a company we worked at together, and we did a spin out, and then started Streamcap together. So
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's it's a cool journey being able to work at some startups, get that, being able to just go 0 to 1 with constraints and all these different factors. I think are you learn a lot from that. So it's really cool to see how you took those experiences and eventually ended up at Streamcap. And I know that you started your career at NetBase doing natural language processing before LLMs were really prevalent.
yeah,
I have my own personal story on that. Like I was working on some AI projects back in 2019. And I remember corporate at the time was like, oh, it's a black hole that we're just throwing a bunch of money in, but let's just see what happens. But now it's like, no, people, it's completely flipped. People can't get enough of AI now. So it's just funny how things change so quickly.
yeah, for
But
sure.
at that base, when you're doing NLP stuff, like how is that? And like, how did that early experience shape your way of the data industry, your view of the data
Yeah,
industry?
it was interesting. I mean, definitely what we were trying. Funnily enough, NetBase was actually called, the company I joined was called Acceleration, and was trying to use NLP for something else, like try and solve like R&D research problems, which I think the problem we were trying to solve, LLMs would do a fantastic job of today. And NLP, I think there were multiple problems with it, but NLP was, it was nascent. We built our own stuff, and it was our own models. We had research scientists working on it, so I think we had pretty state of the art technology. It's just state of the art was not enough for that problem. And then we kind of pivoted into or we did pivot into like social media monitoring, which was definitely more interesting. But I think one of the practical realities of that was I think we had a kind of classic startup problem of maybe falling a little bit too much in love with the technology. And so like we had the idea of using NLP to do sentiment analysis on social media posts, and report that back, and help customer or companies understand how their customers felt about their products, and do market research, things like that. But some of the companies in that era, like that were really successful with social media monitoring, did something much much simpler, which is more just like keyword matching, and sort of that was just like the very basic thing you needed to do. And so
Mhm.
we were trying to solve a much harder problem, when we would have been probably better off just telling how many times social media folks mentioned your brand. And that was like the first sort of big exit in the space. Was I think it was Radian 6, and they sold to Salesforce, and all they did was just keyword matching on social media posts, and did a lot better than we did doing NLP. So I think one lesson, it's not necessarily a data lesson per se, but it applies to data, is just I think don't fall too much in love with your technology, such that you're trying to find problems that fit into that, rather than just solve the problem that your customer has.
Yeah, well, you know what? It's funny because you mentioned that for NLP and sentiment analysis, but I think it's actually a poster child right now for a lot of AI startups as well. Where I know early stage, like I've talked to a bunch of early stage founders like myself, and their thought process is, oh, AI will change the way all of us live. how do I shoehorn problems into it? Which, exactly like you mentioned, I think one of the biggest issues there is when you start with the technology first, you have to like, I think for most problems, AI can be a prevalent solution, but you have to start with the problem first and then work to the technology, because otherwise you're just trying to really shoehorn any problem into an AI solution, which it might not be optimized for. Like maybe I don't need summarization for a
Yeah.
specific problem, right? Like where is the benefit of AI?
Yeah.
And I think one really evident thing I know an early stage founder is doing that is especially on consumer facing or customer facing documents. When they talk about how they're using AI to do X, I already know that it's probably around that. They probably started with that mindset, because at the end of the day, it's AI is not the selling feature. It's the value is really the features you can build with the AI,
Yeah.
and that's what should be in your customer facing documentation.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, so you had your time at NetBase, and then you also went to BrightEdge, where you helped scale the company from single digit millions to $100 million in revenue, which is it's an amazing, great growth phase there. So like, what were some key lessons you learned there before you eventually went up to Streamkap?
Yeah, so I think some of the key things were, early on we had very good product market fit, and so it was more about just the more you put into things, the more you got out, right? Like we had, for me anyways, like I was doing sales at BrightEdge, and my main point of friction in my life was like companies procurement. That like that was the main thing that was slowing us down, and we had some competitive stuff. And so I think some of the key early learnings were just being super high velocity, and we were like really on top of our deals, and that made a big difference in moving things forward quickly. And then also just being really aggressive about winning market share, because we started at a very similar time to another competitor, and ultimately grew like 3 times as fast as them. And part of that was the velocity, and part of it
Mhm.
was just super detailed understanding of our value prop relative to them, and being very aggressive about our approach to win market share, both in terms of head-to-head deals, as well as going to their customers and getting them to upgrade to BrightEdge, was a big part of the early journey for sure.
Mhm.
Um, and that I don't this is, I don't remember exactly, but let's say that took us to 50 million or something like that.
Yeah.
And then the next piece was, I think pretty classic, like crossing the chasm kind of challenge, where I think we did a very good job of, BrightEdge was an SEO platform, is an SEO platform. We did a very good job of solving problems in those first few years that like SEO practitioners had.
Yeah.
So these were people, they work implicitly, like because they had SEO in their title, like they were somebody who, that company already thought this was a good channel for them to get, more traffic to their website. And obviously there's some downstream, outputs of that, but let's just say traffic is the first step on that journey. And but that, we kind of saturate that market, and we like, okay, there's a bunch of other companies that, you know, that probably could get value from this, but maybe they haven't decided that. And so,
Right.
then you have to go convince like a digital marketer that like has multiple tools in their toolbox that this is the right channel to focus on. And that was definitely, a challenging, shift, because you're selling to a different buyer who has a very different set of requirements. And I don't know if I'd say that's a fully solved problem for them. Yeah, it was a challenge, but nonetheless, the company continued to grow, and I think we kind of made our way through that. But it was a challenging transition for sure.
Yeah, I guess one thing that's really interesting there is you mentioned, digital marketers who I started to recognize, or hopefully start recognizing, the power of SEO, right? And I think education is such a important is an important factor there. Where like sometimes they just won't know. So like it's not only about solving the problem for them, it's also them recognizing that, oh, this is the channel that I should be investing in, right?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, there's some parallels to what we're doing today, where in the data world, traditionally most data is handled with batch processing, and we're help making streaming easier. And part of that is definitely a big part of is education about like what are the advantages that it offers, and in particular, like the industry has moved on a lot. So like 10 years ago, I think you could very credibly say that almost nobody needed it. You only use streaming, and when you absolutely have to have real time data and you have a really strong business case for it. And that's still, certainly where the core of what our business is companies that really need, like, have to have very low latency data. But
Yeah.
increasingly, things are changing, and the sort of ecosystem around, data is much more supportive of streaming. And so, I think people's knee jerk reaction of like, oh, that's going to be too complex or too expensive, actually isn't always true anymore. And in a lot of our use cases, it's actually, cheaper, and certainly competitive from a complexity perspective. So yeah, definitely some good lessons there on, like, how do you educate the market, and get people to see some of the opportunities that you can solve for them.
For sure, for sure. And I think that's a pretty good transition to Streamkap as well, right? So, just for our viewers who might not know, so Streamkap's a platform that enables businesses to switch from slow batch processing, as you mentioned, to real time data streaming. And I'll throw some links in the bio if you're interested. But so you've had quite the background, in data and of course in different facets. But what I guess was there a moment that led up to you realizing that, oh, this is a big issue and I think we should make a startup for it? Like, what was that defining moment, I guess?
Yeah, so I mean, I spent most of my career in companies that did yeah, had data and analytics as a part of what they did with NetBase and BrightEdge. So those were more like, narrower context. Um, and so the journey to Streamcap was a couple of hops from BrightEdge. So I went to go work for my now co-founder at a company he started called Avora, which was like an end-to-end data platform.
Mm,
So he did everything from, data ingestion, data warehousing, data modeling, dashboards, and AI insights. And without going too deep into the details, ultimately that didn't work out. We had some big customers go out of business during COVID, and we kind of pivoted to focusing on the AI side of things. But a use case that ultimately was probably more appropriate as a feature than as a full platform. And then we did a spin out, though, because the data ingestion side of things, we had a product there that was part of Avora, which had some components that we thought really had, legs. And so we spun that out into a company called Gravity Data, and doing batch ETL, so competing with companies like Fivetran.
right.
And we had a good product. We were a little bit like, it was a strange situation just because it was a spin out. But ultimately, we had some timing challenges because we did that, and we spun it out in early 2021. And
Right.
at the time, felt like we had a pretty good understanding of that market. 5chan was doing well. There was another company called Stitch, which was acquired by Talend, was kind of like on the decline because Talend was sort of leaving it to die on the vine. And so, oh, there's this sort of opportunity in the lower down in the market. Um, and then $1 billion of funding went into that market in 2021.
All right.
And we weren't fundraising at the time, so we realized by the end of the year, like, oh, we kind of lost this battle just on the basis of our competitors now have these huge war chests, and we don't. So we ended up working out. We had a good product, and found a good home for it, and sold the company. But one of the things we'd seen at Avora and at Streamkap, or sorry, at Gravity, was um, you know, folks who were starting to move into streaming, and requirements where they wanted to deliver low latency solutions, or just event driven solutions. And generally, when people were doing that, they were standing it up with their own Kafka, which
Mhm.
folks are familiar with it. It's an open source project. It's great. It's great software, but it's hard to manage. and
Yep.
uh, and so folks would spend months getting to production data pipelines. And we'd just come from the experience in our batch ETL company of getting people moving data in minutes, right? And so we kind of knew about, like, what is the experience you need to provide for that. And what we wanted to do is bring that experience to the streaming and real time world
Right.
with Streamcap.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I know. Honestly, even in ETL though, like I was looking into ETL solutions a couple months ago, and it's I I know there's a couple of competitors in the space, but I think there's still a lot of room to improve
It's
personally.
definitely not. I mean, the reality of ETL is, I think it's one of those things that it's never going to be like a fully solved problem,
Mhm.
at least in the way that things are architected today, because you have you have a really, like, challenging long tail problem there. So, you know, there's almost inevitably any company is going to have like, you know, some SaaS vendor that they use that, you know, has an API that like isn't supported by Fivetran or Airbyte or something like that.
Yeah.
And then, you know, there's also challenges on the like even the really big connectors, right? Like I was talking to somebody the other day who uses Salesforce, and you know they've got as a big company, they have a really customized Salesforce instance, and you know I think they were using Fivetran, but you know I think this would probably be true for a lot of ETL vendors. They just can't get like these custom objects out via the API, and there's always problems. So yeah, it's a really challenging problem, and one which we actually have a perspective on where we would like things to go, which is like, you know, the model of you know vendors, you know, standing up an API interface as the mechanism to share data with their customers is problematic, right? Like there's some advantages because it offers sort of a data contract that is a consistent model that the customer is consuming, but it also
Mhm.
puts the onus on the customer to go either buy a third party tool like Fivetran to connect to that API to get their data, or they have to go and like, you know, write some custom Python scripts or something like that, right? Like it
Yeah.
basically puts a lot of onus on the customer, and you know, so one of the things that we're starting to see more of from our customers is they're actually using Streamkap to send data to their customers, right? And so
Mm,
therefore, instead of standing up an API, they're just saying like, hey, we'll just put we'll stream the data into your Snowflake or into your S3 or what have you.
right.
And so we'd love to see that as the model, as a way to kind of kill ETL as a mechanism. But you know, I think that'll be a long process. You know, we've got to get all the vendors to adopt it. So, but we'll see. But I think there's some interesting things happening in data sharing, whether it's the architecture I described or you know, Snowflake data sharing, things like that,
Mhm.
where maybe we'll see a better approach than the kind of current um, dominant model in ETL.
100%. And I mean, like, beyond even, like, getting the connecting to the data, even when you get it into your data source, having to manipulate the data so it fits into whatever, database or repository you're trying to like into your, structure as well, that's also a pain. So I think there's just
Yeah, for sure. I mean,
so many opportunities there.
yeah, and I mean the data world has a few of those problems, right? Like you have, let's say, the current model of ETL and this long tail of APIs and ever changing data models, and then you have data modeling as you bring all your own data together, right? Like that was that's another, you know, sort of endless problem to a certain degree, right? Depending on the questions you have, and you know all the changing underlying data models. And then you also have like different ever changing requirements for like how that gets shared out to the business, dashboards, what have you. So yeah, there's a lot of high surface area problems in that space.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. And I know you mentioned, so earlier on you mentioned how, a lot of the use cases for real-time streaming is now changing, and that's part of the reason why StreamCap is now more relevant than ever. So I guess can you share some of those use cases that you feel like have changed over the years, and
Yeah, I mean,
why
one
it's more
one
important?
thing I think I like to look at it partly just through like a lens of a consumer, right? So, like, if you think about what your expectations are, you know, for you know, transportation, right? Like
Yeah,
before Uber, you know, you just sort of like go out and there was no technology involved in that at all, right? Like you go out and just
just
stand on
wave a
the corner
taxi
and wave, or you call maybe you call on the phone and hope that a taxi would show up at your house.
for sure.
But now like we have, you know, this fantastic coordination of different elements with our phones to order an Uber or order. I think a better example even than that is like Uber Eats or any other kind of food delivery where you have this like really complex coordination problem,
Yeah,
and that would not be possible without real time data, right? So if I order something on Uber Eats, you know, that sends the order to the restaurant. That, you know, they need to like get that into their queue, obviously. You know, there's a rider or a driver who's going to pick things up, and so they've got this, you know, this list of all the like pickups they've got to do, drop offs, everything like that. And then as a consumer, I want to see where my order is, right? And all that stuff is powered by real time data. And so you know, that's becoming more and more common, right? Those
right.
kind of experiences. Now, Uber is a huge company. You know, they've got you know, big engineering teams, and so they can run Kafka themselves. But there's, you know, a lot of other businesses that want to do that kind of thing, and you know, can't dedicate huge teams to go and build it. And so that's the kind of thing we're solving for. So yeah,
Yeah.
we see. I mean, that's just one example, but we see that kind of thing in the like point of sale and in retail and restaurants and just generally in payments, in logistics. So not necessarily directly exposed to consumers, but there's a lot of coordination problems and things like that where having real time data is super valuable. And yeah, like say financial services, there's a bunch of use cases where people need and want data in real time.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of it is driven by just overall an increasingly real time world that we live in, and different levels of expectations around the information that you're going to get from the companies that you work with.
100%. And I mean, the easier the process is to get that set up, the more possibilities they are, right? Like if you don't have to necessarily, hire a bunch of Apache Kafka developers or learn it all by yourself, and you're able to spin up an instance or easily connect it using your using Streamkap. Great. Like, I don't, it just makes things a lot easier for me. I can move on to other things while
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I think
using the benefits.
that's like there's another example from Uber actually that's relevant to that, right? Like when Uber was first started, I think one of the criticisms was, the market cap, total market cap for taxis or black cabs, maybe it was, or black cars, is like $7 billion. And so like how could Uber be, now Uber has way more revenue than that,
Right.
perceived total. So like there's a TAM expansion that happened for them. And I think that sort of same thing happens when you start to make things easier, right? Like if it's not a huge cost increase to deliver real time data, then and you can deliver a better customer experience in doing that, then you're going to find more ways to leverage it.
Yeah, plus I think, I mean, we haven't even talked about this side of things, but LLMs and AI relies on context, and and you need to stream data in. And I think more and more important, it's going to be more and more important to be able to, yeah, get data as quickly as possible when you're browsing websites and applications, and feed that into LLM so they can do personalized like a personalized outputs for
Yeah,
users,
absolutely.
right?
And that's actually, one of the main areas that we're seeing, from like an AI perspective that we're seeing, Streamcap. Well, we're part of those architectures. Let's say, it's not something that you know, we're at the front end of, but we're in the plumbing associated with it, right? And
Yeah.
so, for example, in e-commerce, it's actually not LLM powered, but we have customers who are using, vector powered real time, recommendations. And the starting point for that is you have like actually it's helpful to think about the traditional way that like recommendations have worked for e-commerce, or you have some batch process that happens no faster than overnight, and often maybe a week or 2 weeks ago, right? So you have like a static set of recommendations for your existing customers who are going to come in, and you can process that for them if they visit, right? So a couple of problems with that. One is you having to pre-process everything,
Yeah.
because you don't know who's going to show up, and so you better be ready. And then the other is like you have no context for what's happening in that session, right? So they could be an existing customer who happens to be doing some very different shopping on that particular day. They could be a brand new customer who obviously you have zero historical context for. You also have the other side, like the inventory side of that, which is you have new products. How do they fit into this, right? So if you can handle those things in real time, it opens up a much more impactful personalization experience. And I think a lot of that's kind of inspired by like the North Star personalization is probably TikTok, right? Where they just
Right.
like they know without any other context, right? They know in 7 seconds as you're watching, or less than 7 seconds you're watching a video, what's the next video that they're going to show you, and they're going to learn super fast. And they don't need anything else to do a great job with that. And there's a lot of folks who aspire to be able to provide that kind of thing. It's now, at one point, TikTok was certainly the best in the world, but I think some of those tools are becoming more commoditized and things that people can leverage even without the world class machine learning folks that they have. So you can actually now provide those kind of experiences a lot more easily.
Yeah, no, 100%. And actually related to TikTok, I know recently there was a report that came out that apparently TikTok knows that it takes, I think, on average 25 minutes to get addicted to the app. So like, and a big part of that is the algorithm. That the algorithm just gets to know you and your personal and your preferences so quickly that
Yeah,
everything is just a dopamine hit over and over and over again, and like very very quickly. And that comes
yeah,
down to how well it's done. So yeah, no, I'm very excited to see how real time changes things. And actually, real time recommendations would be great because yeah, like you can have an Amazon account, it can gather context for you while you're shopping and give recommendations like that over time. But if it can more like over a session, if it's able to basically see what you want and able to learn very quickly and feed those recommendations and feed that data into a recommendation model, it could be very, very relevant to shopping, not over time, but over a session,
Yeah.
including your old data. So I think, there's now that you're talking about like that, I think there's the possibilities are really endless once you have lower latency recommendations.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's a big impact for, for e-commerce and I mean, consumer web in general. There's a lot of opportunities for,
And and,
making
and
better experience.
And I know one of the big features Streamcap also has is change data capture
Yeah,
for various databases. Can you just explain what that means
yeah,
and why it's important?
yeah. So, a database is, there. If you're, we can use an e-commerce example, right? So, like, there's a database behind every e-commerce site that's recording orders and adding things to cart and things like that, right? And so all those changes um, are being reflected in the database, but at the same time, they're also being captured in a log. And that
Mhm.
log, those logs were initially built so you could have replicas and things like that for having better reliability and fallbacks and things like that. So, but they're also actually very useful to capture data because uh, prior to change data capture, actually technically there's some few different kinds of change data capture. But when I say change data capture, I mean log based change data capture. So in the absence of that, the typical way that you would get data out of your database, your transactional database, that and then into something like Snowflake to do some analysis on it, you would generally do a query. So you'd either do incremental queries or a big snapshot that captures your full database. And that's a problem because it's puts load on that source database. So you'd have to like time those queries on the database when you didn't have a bunch of customers on it. You do it overnight. Let's say
Yeah.
if you're and so you're putting load on the database. You have, you have if you're doing it daily, you only have that yesterday's data at any given time. So it's slow. Incremental, you could do hourly, you could do it more frequently, but all those are relatively inefficient because you're putting more load on the database
Right.
to get data out, and all the while the database as a part of its core operations is writing out every change to this log. And so, you have a source of data that is not producing any additional load. And if you just read it, you can get the data out. So, companies started doing log-based change data capture, and that's I think increasingly becoming the preferred approach. And I think most folks approach that way. And there are the batch ETL tools can do that, but then the problem is you have essentially a natively streaming source, right? Every change is like an event that's being recorded to the log in real time, and
Yeah.
then batch ETL tools take that native streaming source and just slow it down because their systems are batch processing. So
Got it.
basically, streaming, that was one of the first places we looked because we said, okay, well, like there's a ton of people who want to do this. There's generally database data is high volume, so companies are sensitive about the cost of that data, of getting that data out. It's naturally real time. It's often the data that because it's the most core data for most given businesses. It's the one that you most want in near real time or in real time. And so there's a lot of reasons why it was kind of a good fit for streaming, and where we wanted to focus most of our initial efforts for Streamkap.
Got it. So if I understand correctly, so when it is being written to these data logs, you guys are it's basically like an event driven. Like you'll see the event and you'll automate like you'll stream it to Streamcap.
Yeah, yeah, we pick it up and then we stream it to we stream it through Streamkap. I think is a good way to think
Right.
about it. Like we then send it on to whatever they're using for analytics generally. So our initial use cases were very much like database to database. So
Yeah.
somebody would be reading from Postgres into Snowflake or Databricks or BigQuery, ClickHouse, and now we're seeing more folks who are also we're built on Kafka, by the way. I can't remember if I said that, but
Yeah.
so we think it's great, but the main challenge with it is if you manage it yourself or even use managed services, you're managing lower level systems. So we abstract all of that away. And yeah, generally our customers start with like database to database kind of use cases, or multiple, to multiple in some cases. But then they often grow into, well, actually, we've got some events we want to write into your Kafka, or they might want to read from our Kafka to to power other downstream services. So we're seeing more and more of that as well, actually.
Right. And I guess, we sort of touched on this earlier, but with ETL solutions, of course, beyond just databases, there's also direct connections to third party services as well, which of course introduce a lot of issues like you mentioned. But I guess I guess, is that a domain focus that you guys have? Or are you just focused on databases, or like what is your approach there? Because yeah, I mean, obviously that's that's another big data source for a lot of people.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I don't think, having been in the batch ETL world and API world previously, I think we kind of know exactly what's involved there, and it's not our aspiration to go and build all of those connectors and be, I think that's one big reason for that is that most of them are batch batch data sources, and so we don't necessarily offer any real advantage for that, right?
Right.
Like we're going to be, figuring out there are mechanisms for this, like so we could do it, but then you're taking a batch source and then sending it into the stream, and like I said, we don't really offer a particular advantage there, but there definitely is some demand for that, and certain high volume sources like Salesforce are things that we probably will build, and Salesforce actually specifically has like a change data capture mechanism. So that is more like streaming, and then there are others that are like kind of have API sources, or like website events, amplitude, heap, things like that, where
Right.
it kind of naturally makes sense that it would be a good source for us. So I think those are things that we're kind of looking at. There's something else that was coming to mind, but I'm blanking on now. But anyway, yeah. So I think we're not going to go build everything, but there are
Yeah.
some that make sense. Um, Zendesk actually was the other one I was thinking about. There tends to be like kind of high volume of stuff coming out of there, and we've had some requests for that. So um,
Right. Makes sense. Well, I think it's really interesting. We talked about this a little bit earlier about how real time can, affect LLMs and the context that they get, and then some of the recommendations. And of course, there's been a lot to be made out with the current state of AI, and of course, everybody's, trying to find the best applications to build out with AI. And of course, data is we're at the core there. Garbage in, garbage out. So your data is really the gold mine that powers it, which is really interesting, especially for someone like Streamkap, where you guys are like the pipe, and like you mentioned, like you're the plumbing for that. So I guess specifically, if we shift the conversation towards AI more specifically, we talked a little bit how real time streaming enhances AI, but I think specifically, you mentioned supporting RAG, retrieval augmented generation, for large language models with Streamkap. So can you sort of explain a little bit of the context there of like how Streamcap really helps with it, and what that means for people going forward?
Yeah, so I mean, we haven't seen a ton of that yet, to be honest. Like,
Yeah,
I think that's a context where having well, context actually is really relevant, right? So,
of course.
like RAG, I think ultimately is you're adding some relevant context for your use case, let's say, before you're submitting to a more general like LLM, right? And that's that's that context is really, I think, where real time data can come in, and it comes back to a little bit like we were talking about earlier, like what is that particular, if maybe it's a customer service use case, what is some of the history we can include, what is the current session behavior we can maybe include with that message that goes into the chatbot, alongside what the customer's explicit question, let's say. And that's the sort of thing where having like real time data is really really interesting there. But I think the reality of that is we've certainly let customers pull us into use cases, but
Right.
we've not been pushing that so much, and maybe it's to my detriment. But I think we tend to focus on like very tangible production use cases that people have. And
Yeah.
I think the reality is, it's very clear to me that we're going to see a huge impact from AI. But kind of going back to the to the beginning, what we're talking about with NetBase, I think we're looking for like what are the specific problems customers are trying to solve, and not so much in the like experimental stuff,
Yeah.
because we've got a we have very real business and with the stuff that we're doing today, and so we're interested, we're keeping an eye on it, we're like happy to support customers in that, but we're not necessarily chasing that so much as like seeing what are the patterns where we get something that looks like a very repeatable thing. So like the recommendations I mentioned, that's something that like it's really clear. Like the one of our customers who's implemented that, they've got like 10% um, top line revenue growth having
Right.
implemented it. So like really meaningful revenue growth. So it's like, okay, that's something like clearly it makes sense, to go and find other customers for it. But we're still a small company. We don't want to waste resources on things that are not going to be an ongoing use case, if that makes
Oh,
sense.
fair enough, right? And especially early stage, you gotta pick and choose your battles. So if you know
Yeah,
that something is more assured, especially when you're just trying to grow the company, you should definitely take that. Yes, especially when you know it's going to be doing a great job. So that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, I think what's really cool is that just putting the infrastructure out there enables so many more use cases that people can use the infrastructure for. And as that starts to develop, and if you see a bunch of customers using it in a novel way, you can start to support those use cases as that business case becomes more viable. But just putting the infrastructure out there is already such a big help for a lot of people
yeah,
who
yeah, for sure. I mean,
can use it in unique ways.
the most basic thing that we're typically solving for is like, there's a data engineer and they're saying like, I need to get data into Snowflake faster or into ClickHouse faster, and like, and then I think we want to understand the downstream stuff, but actually
Yeah.
like that person is like, you know, their their narrow technical problem has nothing to do really with like the downstream stuff. So like, we're very interested in it, but at the end of the day, like, we got to solve an immediate challenge, and I think we're fortunate actually that we're solving a very immediate technical challenge for folks, and so that's our first priority, and then we're obviously very interested in like what does that enable for companies. And I think that allows kind of the loop, right? Like you can start, and this kind of relates a little bit to crossing the chasm kind of stuff. Like right now,
Yeah.
we're solving problems generally for people who know, they know they have a problem and they want to solve it, right?
Yeah.
And then the next stage in the journey is like, comes back to that storytelling of like, helping companies understand, the opportunities that may exist if they, get real time data into their systems.
100%. But even like for somebody like myself, for example, if I ever, if I ever need real time streaming inside my platform or whatever I'm building with application, it's just good to know that rather than having to spin up this whole Apache Kafka instance, I could be able to, use something like Streamkap in order to do that very quickly.
Yeah,
And that enables so many more possibilities because the reality is, like if we just look at a higher horizon, like 20 years ago, hosting something on the internet was a pain because you had to have this whole server rack and do all these different items. But now you can just spin up an AWS instance and get going and host whatever you want, right? And I think maybe not to the same vein, but this is also there where
yeah,
ETL solutions made it easy to connect with different connectors, and in this case, it's making real time streaming on a large level a lot easier. And so as it becomes more and more easier, it just enables way more use cases,
yeah,
and not only for the big companies who have more you know more thought out use cases, I guess, but even for smaller startups, if that infrastructure layer is there, just adds so much value that they can
yeah,
they can implement in
yeah.
very interesting ways.
Yeah, and you can start that way, right? It's a little bit like, in remote regions that have like more recently got communication, like they never had landline telephones, right? They just
Yeah.
like jumped over to mobile phones, and like, at one point mobile was very expensive and, a luxury item, and then all of a sudden it became, just the actually the easiest way, or satellite internet with Starlink, right? Like,
Yeah.
that was like crazy expensive, and now it's like, it's just a no brainer if you live in a rural area that's what you're going to go with, because it's, cheaper and better than any kind of land based services. So,
100%. Well,
yeah.
very, very exciting. And I know recently you guys just raised $3.3 million in pre-seed and seed funding. So first off, congratulations on that. I think one of the biggest questions for a lot of founders is just like, not only how do you go about investing and getting, the right investors, but like, how do you actually evaluate investors on your end too? Like, how do you know, hey, these are the right investors to take us forward? So I guess for you, like, how is that, like, how do you answer that question for yourself?
Yeah.
And then how do you feel like you guys are going to deploy this capital to keep going?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think a big part of it was in maybe this isn't super helpful for folks, but like most of our investors are folks that we ended up knowing for some time, right? Our
Right.
lead investor in our seed, I met actually even before we started Streamkap, and so I think that the reality was that with the exception of the folks who led our pre-seed, who we did meet relatively quickly. Like mostly we were able to build a relationship over time, and obviously that has benefits for both sides, right? Like you kind of can get to know one another and see how you operate, and I think that's some. So I guess my maybe the takeaway for founders is like get out there and start connecting with folks, and maybe before you even started a company, and have a bit of that signal, so that it's not just a cold thing, and hey, we're closing we're trying to close this round in 3 weeks, and they've got to make a quick decision based on whatever context you can give them that window. If the investors have a longer time window, they have more ability to judge you and what you bring to the table,
Right.
and similarly you have more signal on them, right? So I don't know, that's something that I think is a consistent pattern for us across our
Mhm.
investors, for the most of them. And then yeah, I think the other thing is, well, I don't know, this comes out of that, right? Like being able to spend more time with them is like how well aligned are you on values and what you're trying to achieve, and do they have a good handle on what your vision is for the business, and have a good alignment there. Which I think we've been very fortunate that our investors have been great, great support, and very helpful as we're thinking about how we build a business. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, I think, especially in the earliest stages, right? Like, you can go the transactional route, I guess, where you can say, "Hey, we're raising," and like you do the whole cold outreach just from ground zero. But the reality is, a lot of the inherent bet that investors are making at the earliest stage is on the founders. And yes, idea and your execution matters. But if you play just a transactional game, it's a much harder sell, because the reality is you don't have too much to sell at the beginning. There is like more of an emotional, or like maybe emotional is not the right word, but more of a bet that they're making at the beginning, rather than just looking strictly at financials or traction,
yeah,
right? And so I think, to your point, it's the more you can reduce the conversation based on just metrics or just on those other aspects, the better it probably is to try bringing investors in, especially at the earliest stages.
yeah, for sure. And this is also like I didn't go to an Ivy League school.
Right.
I've worked in Silicon Valley my whole career, but don't necessarily have like the FANG background where like there's just that's one thing that if you don't have that historical context, the investors are looking for some kind of signal, right? And that's why people with those kind of like pedigreed backgrounds get investment more easily, is that like, oh, that's some signal to the investor that like there's some pattern matching that works there, right? And if you don't have those things on your resume, then it's going to be a lot more very difficult to get funding, which is like a cold push, right?
100%.
And yeah, so kind of building. Look, it's all people, right? So building relationships is super important. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, like, that's actually a very good transition, because beyond recruiting investors, you guys are now, of course, expanding your engineering team and your sales team. And I think too many people on the early stage really believe, like, yes, the idea, product, all that really matters, but I really tend to believe the people that are building it is really at the core of it, and
yeah,
that makes recruiting and hiring almost probably the most important thing that a startup can do, honestly, early on. And so, how do you, I guess, what are your thoughts about approaching recruiting and hiring? And especially as the company looks to grow, I think one of the biggest things that they lose is trying to maintain that company culture, and
yeah,
try to maintain that velocity that he had early on as he looked to scale beyond the founders. So, like,
yeah.
what is your thought process around that, especially as somebody who's been there and done that and seen many startups during this
Yeah, for
phase?
sure. I mean, I think one of the actually, I had partially a very similar answer to previously, which
Right.
is that, like when we first started, our first engineers were people that we had worked with in at Gravity and Aurora. So we already knew them. We knew we had a good fit. We already had an existing culture and connection and trust mutually, right? Which is super important. And then as we added some of our first engineering external hires who by the way, most of our team are people we knew before.
Right.
But the people we added, we took a kind of more a cautious approach, and, started out with consulting projects, got a chance to know each other that way before bringing them on full time, and that's worked really well for us. So I think for the sort of immediate term, we're going to continue to focus a lot on sort of relationships where we can, right? I think
Yeah.
that's for me, that's just the safest bet. Like, I know I've got a great network of marketing and salespeople that I've worked with previously, and so that's where I'm going to kind of start first. And I think the other thing is, yeah, if that's not an option for a role, that we focus on trying to kind of increment into it, and if we can do kind of project based work together, that's the best way to do it. But the other thing, even in the absence of that, is setting clear expectations, and and then having the expectation that you've got some milestones to hit, and in sales in particular, right? Like, and sort of if things don't work out, to be decisive, and you can't really afford at this point to have something that isn't really amazing, like have a person that's on this team that isn't amazing, right? And so
Yeah.
that's a kind of key focus. You can't always figure that out up front, but if you do find it out afterwards, just you have to make decisive actions there. So
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think, one of the difficult parts too, I think, especially expectations, like you mentioned, there's a lot of people with great backgrounds and they're like, oh, it's time to go work at a startup. But, they're coming from large fan companies or where it's a very different working culture. Not only in terms of not necessarily having resources or having a bunch of resources and no constraints at those companies. And obviously that's not the case early stage, but even in terms of the amount of hours you have to work or the way that, you evaluate people, based on, hey, are we getting stuff out? Like that, at the end of the day, that's a big thing. And can we be scrappy and get things out as quickly as possible versus necessarily, just having it be on going through a review process over and over and over again, and it taking a couple
yeah,
months. And so I think that, to me, that's also one big issue. And I think that's where like setting expectations become more and more important,
yeah,
where it's
yeah,
like,
for sure. I mean, I
what you're getting
definitely
into.
there were some good lessons, I think, from my time at BrightEdge, of like seeing people come in from Salesforce or Oracle, and it's like, oh, these are famous, like, good sales organizations, and like fail. They're
Yeah.
like, oh yeah, they have a different expectations, right? Like, they're like coming from a known brand, and like have all this process and marketing support and things like that, and like BrightEdge was a decent sized business, but it just wasn't like everybody didn't know the name, right? And yeah, it was a very different deal, and seeing what actually worked in that environment, which was much more like scrappiness, um, and just like what's the word, cadence, and coachability, being able to kind of figure out what's required in that environment. So yeah, I definitely have seen either directly or indirectly, like some of the pain of trying to hire somebody from a company that sounds really good, but actually is really not a good fit at all for your sort of small to mid-sized startup.
100%, 100%. Well, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast, Paul. Really enjoyed talking about Streamkap and your experience there. I have two last questions before I let you go. The first one being, is there a book that you recommend us reading or checking out?
I read a lot, but I don't. I've read sort of some of the like famous startup books, but to be perfectly honest, I think I get the, like, what helps me the most is just like reading as an escape, rather than
Yeah,
like another channel for more startup and
fair
business
enough.
information.
I get that.
Um, I mean, I'll caveat that a little bit. I do read a lot of like biographies and stuff like that. I think that's a really great way to learn about history, and I think it has impacts for business. I'm currently reading Robert Caro's series of books about Lyndon Johnson, which is
Mm,
great. I definitely recommend that. But I also just read a lot of sci-fi, and which is actually interesting. Like, I'm reading Ender's Game right now, or I'm
nice.
in the second book of Ender's Game, which is like a lot of sci-fi that has like AI stuff in it. It's like very relevant right now.
Yeah,
And so like at the center of Ender's Game, or not the center, but one component is like there's an AI, and like is that a human, or is it as a species?
yeah,
So
yeah.
it kind of addresses some of the philosophical side of things in the world we live in today, to a certain extent. So
Yeah, I mean, some of the best innovations have been inspired by sci-fi books too, right? Like,
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
I know Elon's a big fan of Blade Runner. I love Blade Runner too, but like, there's a lot of really, really cool innovations that, we see in sci-fi 50, 60 years ago. And now we're
Yeah,
starting to see manifest now. And it's like, oh, we had those conversations back then, but like we still haven't really solved them. But it's something that I guess a lot of people have opinions on. So that's really cool. And to your first point, actually, before I started doing my own startup, I've always been very fascinated in like building businesses and startups and Silicon Valley culture and all this type of things. But I realized very quickly I've actually stopped reading as much as I did before too, because it's like, yeah, you can know as much theory as you want, but the reality is you have like when you're in the situation, the theory comes inherently, I guess. Like you just have to figure it out in the situation,
yeah,
and
yeah.
so it can be helpful, but like it's not it's more as a hobby, as like if you like reading it for fun more than I would say like, oh, you should really read it to help with your business type of thing.
Yeah, that's a good insight, I think. I have one, I think, very valid criticism of a lot of business books is like that could have been a blog post. And so I do read a lot of blogs about business, and
Yeah.
that I think that level of like condensation, like Dave Kellogg is great for SaaS. Tomas Tungoods is also great. Like he was actually one of the sort of inspirations that's got me thinking more, about the business and getting into entrepreneurship as well. But yeah, in terms of books, more it's an outlet more than a learning area. So yeah.
Okay. Okay. Awesome. And the last question I have before I let you go is just like, what are the next steps for you and Streamcap? What can we look forward to?
Yeah, so we're pretty heads down, growing quickly. So I think right now we're focused a lot on just acquiring new customers. We've got some exciting stuff coming out from a product perspective. We've been doing transformations in the stream for customers, but we're adding more kind of self-serve support for that coming soon, which has been a big thing that folks are wanting to see, and to allow you to kind of manipulate the data on the fly and get further support, lower latency, and lower cost for folks. So those are some things we're pretty excited about as we go into the new year.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast, Paul. And yeah, if we need real time streaming, I know I'll definitely reach out to you and try see maybe there's something we can do there. But yeah, no, I really appreciate it, and it was a great conversation.